Hi, I'm Josh Rushing, and you're in the stream. Today, ending conflict and creating a peace economy. We talked to Johan Gotong about how to do it. Of course, our guest today is no stranger to the stream's community. Johan Gotong is the founder of Peace Studies, now taught all over the world. But he's not just a lecturer. Johan's also put his theories into practice, acting as a mediator in more than 150 conflicts. Welcome back to the stream.
Oh, thank you so much. Pleasure to be with you.
Thanks. I know our community is all over this, Malika. A lot of activity and a lot of ground to cover today, too. What are they saying so far, though?
Well, since the professor is the father and founder of Peace Studies, they're tweeting us about peace. Sergio says, peace can only be achieved when we strive for more than just tolerance. We must aim for understanding. So for those of you at home, if you'd like to join the conversation, please do. Use the hashtag AJStream.
This show is all about the community, and I love the stream because it's all about the community. So we want as many of you to join us as possible. Some are joining us today via Google+. We have folks in New Zealand, Bangladesh, the UK, the US, all interested in issues of peace and conflict. We'll hear from them in a bit. But first, here's how some streamers define peace.
Peace is merely a recess between wars.
Peace is the ability to have healthy children,
coexisting with others and accepting them for who they are and what they believe.
Peace is when justice is fulfilled. It's when everyone is accountable for their actions.
When everything is flourishing, that is peace.
Palestinians have sought self-determination for decades. On Thursday, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas will go to the UN General Assembly to seek non-member observer status for his people. And although there is no veto in the General Assembly, the measure will likely pass. Israel has worked hard to oppose this symbolic move, including on social media. Take a look at this clip from their Washington Embassy's YouTube channel.
The air siren did not go, and it's going on now, so we're just going to duck.
So Johan, I want to start here. This is a big move for Abbas going to the UN to ask for this. Israel's made it really clear that they say that this is counter to the peace process. What do you think this means in the long term for the negotiations?
The term peace process was coined by Washington, I think, in 1993. There is no such thing. There's no peace process going on, not at all. I think it's a very wise move by Abbas, by the Palestinian Authority, by the Palestinians, because it means one step further on the legitimation ladder for Palestine and implicitly down towards delegitimation for Israel. That's why Israel doesn't accept it. That's the real point. And I noticed the word cliff, driving towards a cliff. Well, there's much talk about a fiscal cliff these days. I will talk about a suicide cliff for Israel, fueled by expansion, occupation, and of course siege of Gaza, and seemingly without any stop at all. And one of these roads towards the cliff is decreasing legitimation for Israel and increasing for Palestine.
Okay, so you have a term, or there is a term that I've read a lot in your writings called sociocide. And you say it's moving from sociocide to suicide. Can you explain that?
One doesn't exclude the other. You see, sociocide was a term that I coined back in the 1980s to try to describe what Israel was doing, and not only Israel. If you want an example of it, it is English colonization here, where we are sitting right now, North America, today called the United States of America. And it has material aspect. You push the inhabitants into a corner, and you confiscate, you raze their villages, whatever it is. At the same time, structurally, you marginalize them. And culturally, Well, you let them have their culture, they can speak their language and so on, but it is marginalized.
And that's what you're saying Israel is doing to the
exactly what
Palestinians.
Israel has been doing. Now, there is another term, genocide. Well, there has been the Essene Massacre, April 9, 1948, eagerly protested by Einstein in his famous letter, and by Hannah Arendt and others in New York Times the same year. But by and large, not genocide. It's not massive killing that is the characteristic. It is not the destruction of women and children in order to eliminate the whole group, as emphasized in the Genocide Convention by Mr. Lemkin, who did a fantastic job at that. But erasing the society. Taking away the material base, marginalizing them, letting them keep their culture, but that culture has no role to play in the bigger society. That's what I have done.
Can you make the bridge from that to what you say is happening now, which is suicide?
Because Israel is exaggerating, and Israel doesn't know where to stop. Israel just goes on and on, acre for acre, house for house, apartment for apartment, in East Jerusalem, in Area C on the West Bank, with various kinds of methods and means. Now they say they are in search of secure and recognized borders. They won't get it that way. The way they could get secure and recognized border is by stopping this and opting for a peaceful community, good relations to Palestine. That would be not only Palestine in my view, because Palestine is very small, but in a 6-state community, a 6-state solution with the 5 neighboring Arab countries, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestine recognized, and Egypt. Could be a beautiful community. And of course the model will be the European community. And pay attention, that was no small job to be able to constitute a peace community after the atrocities that Nazi Germany had committed.
Well, okay, speaking of communities, let's get our community involved in the conversation.
Well, it's only been a few minutes. We've already packed in a lot, and so they're responding to 2 things. First of all, Abbas going to the UN. This is a tweet from Osman who says, "It'll not make much difference as Israel's sheer violations of human rights are already put on the back burner at the UN." And one more from John who says, "Nothing will change tomorrow, but it gives Palestine the ability to join the ICJ, the ICC, and other UN agencies, and better ability to negotiate with Israel." But Professor, we brought up the term of sociocide. Now, on our Facebook page, one member of our community wrote a long essay, which all of our viewers can go check out at facebook.com/AJStream. But a part of it we've taken out here. And Elna says, "To avoid this sociocide, it seems morally responsible to say that the state should either embrace characteristics from all of the different cultural traditions of its history or remain neutral and not embrace any of them." She is responding to a sentence that she wrote that you've said, which you support Israel as a state with Jewish characteristics. So she's saying, wouldn't it be better to morally responsible to say that the state should embrace characteristics of all of its inhabitants?
Well, I made some comparison between Israel and Western colonization and the English one in this continent where we are sitting now. But there is one big difference, and the difference is, of course, that the Jews can rightly say, we were there before. Now, to what extent they were there before, how long they were there before, and what happened is something to be contested. But if you look at Genesis 15:18, from Nile to the Euphrates, well, they never had all that in their possession. There is a more modest version in Numbers. But there is a myth, there is some kind of, let us say, religious historical legitimacy. And that's the reason why somebody like me, and I think I share this view with millions around the world, and nothing original, I'm quite willing to say, yes, there should be space in that part of the world for a society with Jewish characteristics. But not for a Jewish state, because that sounds like only for Jews. And certainly not from the Nile to the Euphrates. And certainly not doing that, emptying it for Arabs and then building a 3rd temple, which has been one of the visions they've had. Now, in other words, it's a question of a compromise. And there is today quite a lot of consensus about 1967, June 4th, before the war started, with some modifications. And several of us who have been working on this, we have different types of modifications, and that is all to be discussed. Serious negotiations of that would be important, but I think Israel has probably to undergo a regime change. And I'm not quite sure they are in the mood for that.
Well, Professor, let me ask you, when we're talking about Israel, you've actually been accused of anti-Semitism of late. In fact, in Haaretz, they had some comments from you that said that the factors behind the anti-Semitic sentiment that led to Auschwitz was the fact that Jews held influential positions in German society. Also said that you've recommended the protocols of the elders of Zion as good reading, and that the Jews control the world's media.
Okay. All of this is twisted, and all of these are wrong quotations, but there is something to it. Mm-hmm. It is correct that I have said, yes, I recommend that you read the protocols in order to know what is written there. Mm-hmm. They are fraudulent, they are stolen from Maurice Joly's famous play, and all of that. But you see, much less important than the history of it is that there are millions who believe in it. Mm-hmm. And my point is, of course, that when you have famous Jewish American institutions, financial institutions like Goldman Sachs, doing things that to many people look very similar to what is written about in the protocols, then people will say, there you see. Mm-hmm. So my recommendation is, for heaven's sake, don't confirm the prejudices of your opponent. There are real anti-Semites out there, not the numerous public intellectuals like Noam Chomsky, Norman Finkelstein, myself, Edgar Morin. I don't know how many, there are very many of them, who raise their finger saying, Israel, watch, don't do that. Mm-hmm. So the point is not to confirm prejudices. And in order to know what those prejudices are, you have to read simply the protocols. And one of them is a tendency to control the press. Mm-hmm. Now, I have never said that Israel controls or the Jews control the world press, but the US media, US mainstream media, there are lots of investigations about that. Very high percentage, and that accounts for the kind of unanimity, the lack of debate in serious mainstream media.
That's quite an accusation to say that. It's one thing to say that a number of Jewish people are in charge of some U.S. media outlets. It's another thing to say that because they're Jewish, that shapes the discussion of Israel in the U.S. media.
Well, it's an inference, and I draw that inference, I do. And there are very many people who have sent very sensible commentaries to these media and have them rejected. So, this is a thing that anybody can test, if you will, but there is a consequence, and the consequence is a lack of what we appreciate so much in democracy, open dialogue. Let all the views be known, and there are many views, and I just put forward one. A 6-state solution, a Middle East community, with borders more or less like 1967 for June. Well, when I presented that first time in 1971 as a visiting professor at the University of Cairo, I had a 5 years older colleague with the name Boutros Boutros-Ghali. Mm-hmm. And he published it, 100,000 copies in Arabic and very many in Hebrew. There were no takers in Hebrew and very many in Arabic. Now, why not?
I hate to interrupt you, but you mentioned open dialogue, and we want to encourage that here. We have members of our Google Plus Hangout that are waiting to ask you questions. Fine. Let's go to Sven, and Sven is a student of international relations speaking to us from London, UK. Go ahead.
Hi. Yes, thank you very much for having me on. I would like to go just a little bit further out into the Middle East in general and ask about the Arab Spring, because we're seeing right now in Israel and also outside quite a bit of changes, even today. I was just asking because you've made a claim that the Arab Spring represents kind of a third revolt against empire in the Middle East, particularly against the American-Israeli empire. And I was wondering, 2 years after, do you think that this revolt has been effective? And is it now permanently affecting the face of the Middle East?
I think the Arab awakening, let us not call it spring, because evidently it's multi-seasonal, that the Arab awakening is essentially against the US-Israeli control of the region. Because they have controlled the region by controlling the elites and by supporting elites and more or less telling them you can do whatever you want to do to your own people as long as you follow our line in foreign affairs. This is resented, the dictatorships are resented, and of course when that is resented in massive ways, the way it started some time ago, 2 years ago, then of course the empire will hit back. Mm-hmm. Now, exactly how this thing about Morsi will play out, I think nobody quite knows. But the important point is there has been no protest from the US of any importance. Here the US was lauding the move towards democracy, and suddenly Mr. Morsi seems to be saying that the road to democracy is paved by my autocracy, by suspending, in a sense, the Congress and suspending the legal overview. And these are two rather important characteristics of a democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why does the US support that, or at least not protest it? In my reading, because there are two enemies that they have defined, and one is the Baath secularism, represented by Saddam Hussein and by Assad, father and son, because of the welfare state connotation, the socialist connotation from Washington point of view. And the second one is, of course, Al-Qaeda, which they have to a large extent constructed, but there is something in that construction. So maybe they see the Morsi Muslim Brotherhood, if that's what it is, as the least of three evils. Could be. I don't think that's a stable situation. It will just move on and move on and move on. And I think it will move in the direction that I have indicated, Israel driving towards the cliff. I mentioned one way is through delegitimation. We may get into the period where a number of countries will degrade their embassies in Israel.
Well, I mean, do you see the beginning of that delegitimization with what's happening at the UN on Thursday? And
Precisely.
Spain saying that they're going to back the Palestinian initiative. England is saying that there's no chance they won't vote against it. Is this exactly the beginnings of what you're seeing there?
It's not the beginning, it's a part of it. I think they started a long time ago. And I think that Israel doesn't quite understand that the more violent they are, the less legitimate they become. They lost this last war from the political point of view. Of course, militarily we know perfectly well they're unbeatable technically in the region. But there is much happening outside, as the speaker just said. Let us expand the vision. And that vision includes the whole world. And that sociocided Palestine, the remnants of which are still there, but it is not a real society the way it was, is kind of being reborn internationally through this legitimation. Now, I could say another thing that may happen. There is a South African scenario, because what they did to the Palestinians, I won't say it is exactly equal to apartheid, but it has similarities. The similarities are important. And I must say honestly, they may call me anti-Semitic as much as they want. It is my right as an intellectual to utilize my academic freedom to draw parallels and to say, down the South African road is the United States waiting, maybe thinking that Israel has become a liability more than an asset. What happens from that point on, we know. So
Hey,
when I
Professor,
talk
wanna
about
pull
the
our
suicide
community.
cliff, this is one more way, one more road to that cliff.
I want to pull the community back in, but before we do, Professor, your earpiece has come out, so I'm going to ask you to put that back in so you can hear this next comment. Malika, well, I'm sure they're saying a lot.
Can you be so kind and put it in for me?
Yeah, sure.
They are saying a lot,
Here you go,
Josh,
sir.
you're right. And we've been talking, of course, about the peace process in the Middle East, and now our community kind of wants to shift a little bit. Let's go to a question from Caroline Hargraves, who's speaking to us from the UK also. Go ahead, Caroline. Caroline, you might need to unmute your microphone.
My question is actually about peace economics, not the Israeli-Palestine issue.
Go ahead.
But I'm wondering, the material world is seen by many as the primary reality, and materialism as the dominant value, and economic growth as the primary human purpose, which completely neglects cultural and spiritual dimensions. So I was wondering if there are any concrete steps that individuals, governments, and institutions can take to create this economy for peace, and how to integrate the value of the human being back into economics and decision-making processes.
That's an absolutely key issue for me. Now, in the book Peace Economics, which is just coming out now, there are 121 proposals at the end of the book. And the heading of those proposals are neither capitalism nor socialism, 2 points, eclecticism. And on one of the first pages, there's a quote from Pope John Paul II, lambasting both capitalism and socialism for their materialism, their lack of spirituality. I think to produce much less alienating work where people can create things, can enjoy their creativity, and be appreciated as such. Not necessarily always in monetary terms, but in all kinds of terms, is absolutely essential. And that can best be done at a local level. So among those 121 proposals, you have lots of ideas of stimulating the local community, stimulating cooperatives rather than companies, self-employment rather than being employed. The whole idea of an employee is in itself a capitalist idea.
I wanted to ask you about that because I've read some of that, and I'm curious if you see the idea of stimulating local economy as being mutually exclusive in a globalized world, or is there a way that these things can work together?
I very much see them as working together. It's a both and. You need this work at the top, whether it has to do with currency fluctuations, bailout, or stimulus from the top. But let's pay attention to the fact that many politicians today are bought. The influence of money is big, particularly after the disastrous US Supreme Court decision that money is a kind of expression. So it's under the freedom of expression. Well, you could say that bullets are also a way of expressing. And down in Arizona, there was a person who made use of that particular expression. Fortunately, it's not called freedom of expression. He will get his sentence. But the point about it is, I think we should stick to words in democracy.
We don't have much time, and I want to bring in one more question from the community.
Please.
One more hangouter. He's going to be quick, and hopefully you can give us a brief answer. Morshid, let's go to you in Google Plus Hangout. Morshid is a barrister speaking to us from Bangladesh. Go ahead.
Yes, a very tragic incident occurred recently where over 200 workers died recently in a garments fire. How do you think overall national economic development as manifested in these garments workers' efforts can be balanced with their rights as employees? And how do you think it can alleviate structural violence, something that your writing is most famous for?
We're actually going to get to the answer to that in our online post show. So let's hold that question just for a moment.
Okay.
In the meantime, I'd like to go to Malika with some other leads that we're following.
One photographer's trip to Zimbabwe took an unexpected turn when his camera was stolen by a lion. Photographer Ed Hetherington placed his camera next to a dead buffalo, hoping to get close-ups of the lion feeding. He got the shots, as you can see here from petapixel.com, but what he didn't expect was the lion taking an interest in his camera. The lion ignores the buffalo, snatching the camera instead. Well, the camera was destroyed, but the photographer got his exclusive. Our next lead's out of Russia, where a new app asks citizens to anonymously submit instances when they've had to pay a bribe. The Briber app maps the locations and tallies the cost of the bribes. So far, a little over $197,000 worth of bribes have been documented since September. Well, the app's developers say bribes are often paid to offset low salaries and argue that, quote, laws are written in ways that make it impossible not to violate them. Briber maintains its impartiality, noting it's just holding up a mirror to what's going on. And our last lead's from London, where a fish seller's catchy sales tune has some wondering if it's the next Gangnam Style. The YouTube video of Mohammed Shahin Nazar has been viewed nearly 4 million times. Have a look.
Come on ladies, 1 pound fish. Come on ladies, 1 pound fish. 1 pound fish.
Mohammed's been signed by a major music label and plans to release the 1 pound fish song soon. Well, tell us what you think of those stories. Tweet us with the hashtag AJStream. Josh.
Thanks, Malika. I like that song. It's kind of catchy. I'm going to get it on my iPhone. And you know the lion with the camera? I'm actually following the lion on Instagram now. He's not bad. It's mostly food and nature pictures, but I kind of like it.
I have enormous sympathy for that lion.
That's
I'm
right.
entirely on the side of the lion here. He's saying, you've been photographing me enough.
That's
you
exactly
never pay me a
right.
commission. You're making money off these photos. And I just want to keep it.
So look, go to your computer right now. If you're not already on your computer, go to stream.aljazeera.com because we're going to pick up with that last question for the professor. And then tomorrow, we're going to talk about the internet and the UN and who should control it. Until then, we'll see you online. Welcome back to the post show. We're with Professor Johan today talking about peace studies, the father of peace studies, and we just had a really great question out of Bangladesh. So I want to go right back to that and give you a chance to respond.
Well, the structural violence can best be overcome by many small independent units at the bottom of society. And as I've said several times, inside the society, that means cooperatives. For instance, with sales point in the countryside, with sales point, straight from producer to consumer. And it's very easy to get to these places with modern transportation, but whether they are collective or individual. And by self-employment, which is a very rapidly increasing trend. Getting out of the big companies with the CEO on top. So I would argue for local community self-reliance, periphery country self-reliance, and then of course trade among periphery countries, south, and in Europe, the gypsy, Greece, Italy, Portugal, Spain, Ireland, trading among themselves, much more lifting themselves up by their own bootstraps, rather than only paying attention to Germany. I would argue for Germany cancelling most of the debt in order to reconstruct the European Union, which is suffering very much under the inequality introduced by it, and thereby doing some of the same that the World Bank actually is doing wisely, cancelling the debts of the least developed countries.
Okay,
so there you have examples of things to be done that would counteract structural violence.
Morshad, are you still there? Our barrister from Bangladesh?
Yes, I am.
Did you just hear Professor Galtung's answer to your question? And I just want to make sure, did that answer your question?
Yes, I did.
Does that answer your question?
I just had a question to add on how do you feel in particular with the garments industry, which is nefarious for its the gross violations of, let's say, personal as well as for personal rights. How do you feel that this can be alleviated while also encouraging economic development?
I would claim a little bit ignorance on that one, but you said garment industry. I would say the same thing. Produce more for the local level and directly, and don't let it pass through many intermediaries, you see. That is the point, for instance, made by Ashok Khosla in India. The point that the moment you sell your milk to somebody who converts it into ice cream far away and sends it back to the community, you have doubled or tripled the price. And you can do the same with cereals. Do it, the processing locally as much as possible. The moment you go too much in for trade, I'm not at all neglecting trade, but I think it should be between equals, countries at the same level of development, so to speak. The moment you do that, you will fall into the various types of traps spun by the big international, transnational corporations, and it'll do you badly.
One of the challenges facing capitalism lately is the increasing levels of inequality that it creates. You talk about this some in your new book with discussing the pay, the level of pay for CEOs and leaders of companies as compared to workers. Can you expand on that?
You know, if you take the CEO salary and divide it by the average of workers, you get ratios in some US companies, and not only US, of 500 to 1. So the book actually proposal number 1 of the 121 is get it at least down to 5 to 1.
5 to 1.
But there is another approach, you see, which may be even better or just as good, doesn't it? They don't exclude each other, these proposals. Why shall you pay with money when you make a deal? Why can't you pay with services, with time? 1 hour equals 1 hourage. I give a lecture, 1 hourage, no honorarium, but if somebody could come and clean up my house 1 hour, it would be fantastic. And by saying that, I am saying implicitly that 1 professor hour equals 1 cleaning person hour.
But let
and
me
how do I get
understand
to
this.
that? Because all we human beings are equal.
It sounds good. All human beings are equal. But if you have 2 companies who are very competitive and they need the edge, and you have 1 guy who clearly has the edge, he's going to make a difference in leading your company. If it's at 5-to-1 is the ratio. What of those companies would be willing to pay maybe twice that to make sure they get him and their competitor doesn't get him? How would you regulate that or control that kind of natural competition?
By boycotting the company with the highest ratio, and doing the opposite of boycotting, which we sometimes call girl-cotting. In other words, positively favoring the company with the better ratio. So that means these ratios have to become known. And in the US, there is almost legislation to that effect.
But you say that completely independent of what kind of product they're putting out. If the company with the lower ratio could be putting out a lesser computer, and the other company is putting out the better computer at a better price, you say buy the lesser product in order to support the ratio of the pay between worker and CEO, as opposed to buying the better product at the better price.
I would see these as two independent dimensions. You could struggle with both. I mean, you could in a sense favor the better computer, but you could at the same time issue the warning and boycott.
I mean, I'm thinking of Steve Jobs and Apple, and whether you buy the Apple laptop or not based on how much Steve Jobs is paid, rather than that the operating system works better on Apple.
It's a horrendous exploitation of Chinese workers. And they're committing suicide and all kinds of strife. And it also reflects badly on the Chinese government that they let it happen. So I would say then they should be paid decently, and we consumers would have to pay something more.
Let's take this time and get the community back in.
Well, of course, we're talking about peace economy, and there's some tweets here on that. Caroline, who's actually in our hangout, tweeted this a few minutes ago. In a peace economy, we discard economics, which destroy people and nature, to economics that support the planet's positive progress. And one more from Sharmark, who says, peace economy is currently not possible for the simple fact that those who have will not loosen their grip on the world. So would replacing what you call a killing economy with the peace economy, is that even realistic?
You see, the person who asked that question put it exactly correctly. The basic 2 points in peace economics is the sacredness of nature and the sacredness of human beings. What does that mean? The possibility of nature and human beings to reproduce themselves. And the killing economy, the super capitalism, hyper capitalism we have now, are destroying nature, and at the same time is destroying human beings. Now, this is a thing that people are very aware of, and they would celebrate systems that change in that regard. So, is that feasible? Yes, of course it is feasible. If a Nordic welfare state, combining the idea of economic growth from capitalism with the idea of satisfying basic needs from Marxism, combining liberalism and Marxism
capitalism as well, isn't it?
Well, you see, combining these two in the welfare state, nobody thought that was feasible, and it happened. Took some time, but it happened. Started in the mid-1930s, and it spread to the rest of Europe. You see, being a Norwegian myself, I come from a part of the world where optimism comes natural, because we have seen that such things are feasible.
The Keynesian capitalism that came out of the 1930s and the Great Depression in the U.S., isn't that undifferent, is it? I mean, when you look at some of the stuff that's put in place, like Social Security, for example.
Very similar. It's the built-in crisis in super capitalism. But there's also a difference between a very strong and determined Roosevelt and a rather weak president at present. I'm not in any way questioning his values as a South Side Chicago social worker, not in any way. And I think he very sincerely wants a society.
But you see Obama as a weak president.
Obama, with less inequality. You pointed to that factor. I think that's very sincere, but I have my doubts about him as a political operator. I think he doesn't have the strength. He doesn't use veto. He leans over backward to make some kind of conciliatory moves to the Republicans.
Well, I tell you what, let's stop on this idea of Obama being a weak president, at least on the show, but let's continue this conversation if you're watching in Twitter. Tweet us about it. Let's talk about it. I think, you know, this show is far too short for some of the ideas that you present here. On our next show, should the United Nations govern the internet? We'll discuss an upcoming UN summit that may change the future of online access. Until then, we'll see you online.